Got quite an audience and we want to welcome you. Please say hello to us. I've got Michael Swain, the director of FORSA, with me, and we're going to be talking about something really important. So I need you to, I need you to post this link in your WhatsApp status. I need you to tag people. I need you to share the stream. I need you to phone your friends. I need you to WhatsApp the link out. It's your patriotic duty to get this out. We're proud South Africans, and this is something really important. So I want to just quickly welcome Michelle Lemon. Hi. And the Smiths. Hi, Elizabeth and Graham and Tess. So nice to have you on. I hear Justin. I hope Justin's okay. And then Mike Layard. Hi. Marie Lottring. Hello. Helen Mothersole, good evening. Elsa Kleinans, the audience is growing quite nicely. So please, we have to get as many people on. Get your friends on, your neighbors on, get the people that you met once at the shop on, get your enemies on, everybody. So I see Justin's posting hi, and then I see Michelle and has already started to tag people. Please, if we can get going on that. Hi, Larato. So nice to have you on, Pastor Mariana. Jerome Smith. Jerome, I told him what you said. He's so grateful.
Wonderful.
So let me introduce, maybe you can introduce yourself, Michael.
Well, it's so great to be here tonight, Richard, with you at this great church in PE. I've been involved in different ways with you and your father for many years, and it's a real privilege to be here. If you don't know me, I am Michael Swain. I'm the executive director of a religious legal advocacy group called FORSA, stands for Freedom of Religion South Africa. And we exist to protect and promote the constitutional rights that we have to enjoy freedom of religion. And that is something which we can not only do in private, but very importantly, it is a right that we are guaranteed by our Constitution and by constitutional court judgments to be able to live out, to express freely our faith in our lives, in what we say and what we do in the public space. And it is so important that we protect and promote this particular freedom, because it is literally the foundation of all our other human rights. Freedom of thought, conscience, belief, association, assembly, all these are, if you like, caught in this basket of freedom of religion rights. So very important, and that's what we do. We exist to protect and promote that particular freedom right for all South Africans of all faiths.
Before we get going, I just want to pick up on three people. I want to say hello. Walter, Pastor Walter Shadi, come on, you've got lots of friends. Please get this link out. Then Jackson's hello, so glad you're on. And then Audrey Brunt, she's one of the attorneys that help us. Hello,
yes, lovely.
Audrey, so nice to have you. I hope you're sharing. You said you would. I know that everyone else will. Let's try and build an audience, because this is really vital that this message get out. I just want to... And I want to reiterate that we need to get people online because we're about to start to talk about really important things. So I think let's get going. First of all, maybe let's briefly touch on the litigation to reopen churches, because I think it's going to become quite relevant
Topical.
in about an hour. Where is the case?
Well, as people may be aware, maybe not, but we instituted legal proceedings against the COGTA minister because, as you will recall, in December and right the way through January, there was a complete ban on religious gatherings of all sorts, whereas other similar gatherings were not restricted in anything like the same way. So, for example, it was a bizarre context, Richard, where you could be sitting side by side with me in a casino, and I'm not suggesting that you do that, and we could be pulling the slot machine, and that would be fine, and that apparently would not be a COVID vector or spreader. And yet, if we both found that our losses at the slot machines were getting a bit too much and we decided to now pray together to try and get some favor, that would have been illegal. And we could have been arrested for doing that. And that was obviously unfair discrimination against the religious community. It was not based upon, obviously, data or science. And that's the only way that government is allowed to restrict rights, if it's reasonable and equitable and justifiable and proportionate and fit for purpose. And that clearly wasn't. And so we instituted a high court proceeding, and also to ask the court to declare that religious workers are in fact essential workers, which is very much what we are in this pandemic. We are frontline. And so that case is proceeding. It didn't proceed immediately because literally the day before, on the steps of the proverbial court, the president kind of equalized the scale. But we have now all filed papers with the High Court, and we're now waiting for a court date. So we're hoping for a hearing, and that will probably be sometime later in the year.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on Steve Swart and his wife. We're so glad you're here, and we want to thank you for the ACDP for your efforts in opposing stuff that restricts religious freedom. Please have a good look at the ACDP platform if you're looking to vote. I think I want to pick up on something, and the comments have just disappeared, guys, is that the concept that they use in courts is rationality. So was it rational that you could play, that you could go sit in a casino and pull a lever, or sit in a church with your mask on, or even, and please, we've got lots of sympathy for restaurants, but 50 people sitting in a restaurant, everyone with their mask off. Does it make sense that the churches where, especially in a building today, I mean, the crowd we had looked like there was almost no one in the church, yet it may have been in excess of what some may say. Let's leave it at that. But the point is that the point is that it's about rationality. So, and we haven't let go of the case, partly because of probably what's going to happen at 8 tonight. And then secondly, very importantly, we are determined to strike a blow for religious freedom.
Yeah.
So it's coming up.
Yeah. And that will set a precedent, so that if, once the precedent is set, and assuming we get the judgment, which we believe we will, if government was to try and do something disproportional or unfair again, then we have something immediate that we can act upon. Whereas at the moment, everything can change at any day, and there's really not much we can do about it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the courts haven't gone out of their way to protect religious freedom. I think I don't know if you'd describe that as fair.
I think that is fair. There have been, of course, some very positive judgments, but the very fact that we have to wait perhaps as long as we do, whereas if you look at international contexts, many nations have heard very similar cases to ours, and very quickly, and set the precedents that were needed there. And they almost universally have been that government has overstepped its mark and unfairly discriminated against.
There's been case after case. We want to thank you for everyone who's tagging and sharing. I want to thank you for how the audience is building. Keep going. This is really, really important. I think the next thing that we need to speak about is the amendment bill to PEPUDA.
Yeah.
So what is PEPUDA?
Well, PEPUDA is the preeminent piece of South African legislation under the Constitution. And it stands for the Promotion of Equality and the Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. It's quite a mouthful. It's an acronym. And PEPUDA is what it's known as, or the Equality Act. And basically what it does is it gives effect to Section 9 of the Constitution, which is the Equality Clause, and also gives it to measure teeth, so that you can take out action under PEPUDA if you believe that you have been unfairly discriminated against, or particularly hate speech, or your human dignity has been impaired, or you're suffering some form of harassment. Then that is the law which basically you can rely on. And you can bring a case in the magistrates' court even. So the entry level is pretty low, and the High Court, of course. What often happens, though, with PEPUDA, which is perhaps what makes it concerning even before we go to this level, particularly from a religious freedom point of view, is that often activists will complain and protest of unfair discrimination to one of the commissions, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, and then they will bring an action under PEPUDA against somebody following up on a complaint. And of course, the problem there is that they are then using your and my taxpayer money.
Yeah.
And yet you, as the person who's now on the receiving end of that litigation, you must basically pay for your own legal costs. And as you know, better than I do, it's pricey.
If you could give them an indication of the sort of cost amount that you think the state attorney spends or the Human Rights Commission spends on an individual case where that gets fully litigated.
Well, if it goes right through to the Constitutional Court, I mean, you're literally talking millions of rands. I mean, I've heard figures of between 5, 6, 7, 8 million rand. And of course, again, who has got that type of money to just shell out to defend themselves? And often that's the danger, because they're almost counting on the fact that you're going to cow to financial pressure. And of course, once that happens, then a adverse precedent can be set.
Tell me, before we even get to the amendment bill, have there been any cases that have really attacked religious freedom under the present bill?
Well, we're dealing with one case at the moment, which is the Beloftebos case. And this was a case of a wedding venue, a family-owned farm, beautiful farm, just outside of Hermanus in Stanford. And they really have dedicated their farm and their lives to celebrating what they believe as Christians is marriage between a man and a woman. And obviously they consider it to be, as many do, the most important covenant relationship. It's the reflection of Christ as the groom and the church as his bride. And that's what they do, and their staff and everybody is very involved. They pray for people, they make gifts for people, they really throw themselves into the organization. And a same-sex couple came, and they asked if they would organize and help them to celebrate their wedding. And they very politely said, look, everybody is welcome. Everybody's always been welcome on their farm. They don't discriminate in any way on the basis of your sex or race or whatever it is. But they just said simply, we believe that we should be able to decide what events we organize, in other words, what work we do and how we do it. And so, for example, they wouldn't celebrate, say, a polygamous marriage. They wouldn't allow, I guess, some form of trance festival or something, because they see it as their business and they believe that their values should be respected. But no, here came the South African Human Rights Commission with a lawsuit, and then the couple also then litigated. And it's pretty important to realize how penal the sanctions can be if you fall foul of this act, because the one couple is asking for 2 million rands worth of damages for the pain and suffering that they experienced, even though they almost immediately got another venue and they went ahead and got married anyway. And also, they would not be able to make any form of, if you like, decision about what they would do in terms of the event that they would do. And so that literally would disrupt their entire business and potentially shut it down. So very, very serious. And that's under the existing PEPUDA.
Yes. And there's, I understand, another case in KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah, and that's an even more interesting case in a way, because this was the case of an evangelist, young evangelist, a man called Simeon Chetty, and he was at an outdoor evangelistic meeting, and he simply said, amongst other things, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through him. He is the one, only true and living God, and various other things. And that would be something which we would happily say is almost core to the Christian faith. And yet 3 Hindu organizations, in fact, have now litigated against him under PEPUDA. They even asked the local police to charge him with the crime of crime and injuria for an egregious infringement of their human dignity by what he said. They called it Hindu bashing. And again, they're asking 400,000 rands worth of damages from him, 200 hours of community service. They're asking for basically an order so that he would be prevented from ever sharing those scriptures again in public. And that is fundamentally contrary to our guaranteed rights to freedom of religion, conscience, belief, and opinion. But nevertheless, it gives you an indication. And now he's on the back foot. So he's now having to defend himself. And we, FORSA, are coming in as a friend of the court to basically emphasize the critical importance of religious freedom rights, and that nothing that he said is even approaching the constitutional definition of hate speech.
And I think that that's important. We seem to be heading to an environment where no one can say anything. You know, you can't preach the gospel without the state interfering. And I think let's maybe talk about, so that was PEPUDA. I think let's maybe, I don't know how much you know about the case that's currently before the Constitutional Court regarding Kwalani.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting case because, again, the definition of hate speech in the Constitution is narrow and necessarily narrow. The reason why it's important that we have a narrow definition of hate speech is, of course, the wider the definition of hate speech, the less free speech we actually have.
Yes.
And so the Constitution, among other things, and it's got propaganda, you cannot do propaganda for war and so on. But the real core definition is that it's an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm. And those two typically run together. So classic hate speech, kill the farmer, kill the boor. Who do we want you to hate? Farmers. What do we want you to do to them? Kill them. But when you look at the existing PEPUDA definition of hate speech, it is significantly broadened and much more subjective. It talks about reasonable intention. It talks about speech that is harmful or hurtful. And of course, the more subjective your definition of hate speech, the less certain you know as to whether or not you have actually overstepped the mark, and the more likely to subjective interpretation it is from somebody who's perhaps sitting in judgment of that, or to somebody who feels that you've infringed their particular sensibilities for that. And so, again, the Kwalani case was a case where John Kwalani, who was a journalist at the time, he said some pretty egregious things about homosexuality and homosexual lifestyle and what have you, and really very unpleasant. But did it amount to an advocacy to hatred or an incitement to do some form of violence? No, it did not. And this case has literally gone on for years now.
Kwalani is no longer with us.
He's no longer with us. I mean, literally, he has passed away in the meantime. But the case has continued. And one of the things that he challenged was the definition in PEPUDA of hate speech. The challenge was that it was beyond the Constitution. And the Supreme Court of Appeal, when they heard the case, they agreed with him. And they basically told Parliament that they must go and correct that. But the Constitutional Court, who have heard the case, still haven't ruled on it, so we're not quite sure where it's going to end. But let's assume that the Constitutional Court agrees with the Supreme Court of Appeal, and the judgment was very sound.
It was an exceptional judgment.
An exceptional judgment, and declares that actually that definition of hate speech is unconstitutional. Well, that means that unlawful, therefore, definition has been in force and enforceable for 21 years. And that gives you an indication of how critical it is when government is introducing legislation and passing legislation to make sure that we make our voices heard before it becomes law. Because once it's law, from the moment it becomes law, it is in force and enforceable, even if it's subsequently found to be unlawful and therefore illegal.
I was actually talking to a mutual friend of ours, and he lost a case in the SCA because they said, yes, the other decision, a decision that was made was wrong, but you never challenged it, you did something else. And so even though the decision was probably wrong, because he never challenged it, they said, no, your matter, you've lost your matter, because that stands. And I think that's an important point, is that 21 years later, we're sitting with a bill that is, or an act that is unconstitutional, and it's still likely unconstitutional. It still hasn't actually been decided on. So now we come to the amendment, or the amendment bill to PEPUDA. Was there any effort to take into account the Supreme Court of Appeal decision on Kwalani, on hate speech? Was there anything included in this amendment bill to try and make it constitutional?
No, and that is already quite concerning, because I think at any reading of the judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeal, it would be clear that the existing definition of hate speech in PEPUDA has way overstepped the mark, and therefore they could have amended that in this amendment bill, because that's the purpose of it. But they didn't, for whatever reason. And this amendment bill, if anything, has gone the opposite direction. it has drastically expanded the definition of discrimination, of equality. It's extended liability significantly, and it's even allowed for government to directly interfere, if you like, or intervene and impose standards, which also it puts a positive duty on everybody, organizations, individuals, would certainly include churches, to effectively implement this new definition of equality and discrimination. So it is a drastic overreach, we believe, of where the Constitution, I think, would actually have us in terms of the implementation of this very important principle.
Now, let me just ask, are we, by opposing this bill, which effectively, as I understand FORSA's position, they're advocating against the bill, what about the extreme situation of inequality in our country? How does that affect our advocacy against that bill?
Look, I think it's very important to recognize that the reason why we have this act was specifically because we have had a history of inequality and unfair discrimination. And therefore, there's certainly great legitimacy in the fact that we have a law which is giving access to people to effectively implement and to have their rights recognized. The problem really comes often with laws is not so much in the intention that there may have been, and the legitimate intention, but the unintended consequences. Because often what happens is that these laws, once they're passed, are picked up often by activists, and then they use those to make cases which perhaps the original intention was never there for, but now you're nevertheless facing the fact that, well, yes, if you do interpret it like this, and you can see how it could well be interpreted like this, you then find yourself on the receiving end, if you like. You are then in the crosshairs. And that is where the problem comes. So we are only looking at the potential impact that this may have on our religious freedom rights. We are very obviously sympathetic and empathetic to the very real inequalities that exist in our society. But at the same time, we cannot sit idly by seeing something which we believe has the potential to fundamentally erode our religious freedom rights and not push back against it. If government intends something different, then obviously they have the absolute prerogative to then go back and then say, okay, this is what we really meant, and to redraft and to rephrase and then to reopen it for public comment, and then that will make it clear. But unless and until government do that, we can only look at what is written, and we can only comment on that.
Now, what is it? I see Corinne de Klerk is asking for FORSA bank details. Where could they find FORSA bank details?
Well, the very best place would be to go to our website, which is FORSA or forsa.org.za. And there is a little donate button. So, yes, I mean, in terms of donations, that is how we exist. We only survive, if you like, and we're only able to continue to do what we do because of people who kindly and generously donate to us. So if you click that, there are many ways. Our bank details are there. You can use, I think we've got SnapScan and Zapper and all sorts of other. We even are Section 18A registered, so we even can give tax certificates for donations from private individuals. So that would be tremendous. And every cent helps us, and it will all be applied exclusively to protect and promote our religious freedom rights.
I note that Lynette Lamprecht points out that we have to, I think it was in response to a question from Matthew Cullis, says we've got till the 30th.
Yeah, Wednesday
to object.
Very important.
It's very, very important. Now, before we get maybe more into the objections, let's quickly, how to object, let's quickly pick up the main points that you feel will have the biggest impact on religious freedom.
Well, I think the expansion of the definition of discrimination, I think it's probably important to actually understand how PEPUDA works, because there is a two-stage test, if you like. The first stage is that you have to show that you have suffered some form of discrimination. And discrimination is defined as an act or omission which imposes a burden, obligation, or disadvantage that it does not place on another, or alternatively withholds benefits, opportunities, and advantages that it grants to others. So then you have to show that you have suffered this form of discrimination on a number of grounds, categories. And those categories would include race and obviously sexual orientation and age and pregnancy, and there are all sorts of different gender. There are many different categories. Obviously, some discrimination is fair. For example, if we discriminate on age. We don't allow 5-year-olds to drive cars or to own guns or to buy alcohol. It's probably just as well. That would be seen as fair, I think. But the problem is that once you have shown that you've been discriminated against one of these grounds, that discrimination is then deemed to be unfair. So you are, in that sense, kind of guilty until you prove yourself innocent. And that's when the second stage kicks in, the test for fairness. But the test for fairness is also defined in PEPUDA. It's got some 14 categories. And the challenge with it is that it's very much weighted in favor of the person who alleges the discrimination. And even though our Constitutional Court has said that in terms of the Constitution there is no hierarchy of rights, of course, if you define fairness to favor, if you like, some rights over others, effectively you're establishing a type of a hierarchy. And that is complicated and definitely detrimental. So, for example, you have to prove that you didn't, for example, undermine somebody's dignity. You couldn't be able to show that you're fair if you did that. If that person had suffered from previous patterns of disadvantage, either as a group even, then you could not prove fairness. And that's why when people say, well, it's my sincerely held religious faith and convictions that cause me to do this or to say that, that is not sufficient to escape the net.
And I think it's important to note that that isn't even in the present act. There's no mention of a religious exception.
No.
So if someone is upset by what you preach, and it's straight out of the Word of God, they can take you to the Equality Court as
this happened to Chetty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Guys, the comments have gone. Keep going, Michael. So you were telling us about objections.
Yeah. So that is really already problematic, and one of the things which is problematic about the amendment bill, of course, is that you are able to apply for legal aid to bring litigation under the amended PEPUDA. And that's already happening to a large extent. People are already being able to access through, as I said, the Human Rights Commission and other institutions of state. But now they can apply directly, and it will literally open the floodgates to litigation. And you will never know where it's coming from. And of course, as I said, there's no legal aid available to people defending themselves. Yes. Only those who are bringing litigation. So already, if you like, that is a form of discrimination.
Yes. No, and it puts you at tremendously at the back foot, because, to be honest, what lawyers do is highly specialized, especially in these fields, and it takes a lot of work. As
we have found out,
as we found out, we've worked nights and days to get stuff done. While Michael's prayed, but will they get it done in time? But so, what other objections or what other flaws do you see in the PEPUDA Amendment Bill?
Well, they've added different categories, additional categories to discrimination, and particularly, it is now something which causes you prejudice, which is of course highly subjective, or which undermines your human dignity. And as soon as you start adding in categories like that, well, how do I know when I've caused you prejudice or maybe undermined your dignity? And very significantly, they have specifically said that intentionality is no longer relevant. So whether I meant to or not, and normally, Richard, as you will know in law, you have to show some form of intent before you're actually going to be found to be culpable for something. It's not, you can't just like a reflex, and in fact often some form of a reflex is a defense, if you like. If it's an involuntary action,
yes,
then often that can be a defense in law, whereas they've actually removed intentionality. So whether you meant to or not, whether you like it or not, somebody who now feels that they're human dignity has been undermined or they've been caused prejudice, can now litigate against you. And you never know when it's going to come or where it's going to come from. So that's a very important, if you like, addition, which has made you, as somebody who might be accused of or litigated against for discrimination, much, much more vulnerable. And the other thing which has been a significant expansion is the expansion of liability. So, for example, and we've talked about this in the context of a church, if you cause or encourage somebody to discriminate, then you yourself, according to this amendment, are equally liable as the person who's actually done the discrimination. And so in the Beloftabos wedding case, for instance, if the couple had been members of a local church and the pastor had been speaking about marriage and talking about obviously the Christian
Marriage is between a man
viewpoint,
and a woman.
exactly, and they had gone and done what they did, set up a wedding venue, and they then said no to a same-sex couple. And one of the reasons they did so, they said, well, look, in my local church, this is what we get taught. Then you as the pastor, who has now obviously caused and encouraged them to discriminate, you are equally liable with them. And it even goes further than that, because it expands it to what's called joint and several liability between employers and employees, which means that if you are somebody who is employed by an organization and you do or even cause the discrimination, then unless the employer can show that they took deliberate measures to prevent you from doing so, they're also caught in it. So in that case, it wouldn't just be the pastor who'd be caught, the church would also be caught equally liable. So you have this almost chain of liability, this big net that captures everybody. And of course, that's a serious situation, because the vulnerability, you literally will never know when the hammer's going to fall.
Yeah.
Intentionality is irrelevant.
Yeah.
So even if the employer, the church didn't even know that someone was going to say that or whatever they did, that's now irrelevant.
They could be dragged in.
They could be dragged in.
And I think that what is particularly worrisome is that that activists, with the help of legal aid, can literally go and pick a fight in terms of this act, really. And so everything that you say, whether you in any context, you could end up in equality court. And I think this is very important to understand, is that this isn't just impacts religious freedom. If you have a bad day and you say the wrong thing, you're in serious trouble.
And it can catch you later.
Yes.
I mean, you could have said something some while back and then somebody finds it and uncovers it, and then you can be in trouble.
What's interesting is the England cricket team, there was a guy who said something objectionable when he was 18.
Yes.
And at the age of 27, he was dropped out of the England cricket team because of something he had said 9 years before on Twitter. Now, obviously, we don't support what he said, but to be honest, to hold an 18-year-old responsible, someone responsible for what you do when you're 18-year-old, dear Lord, none of us
were behaving properly.
Yeah. So the bottom line, or saying the right thing. I mean, your brain doesn't even develop properly till the age of 25. So literally, in the current culture, and this act is very in keeping with that culture.
Yeah, it is reflective very much of the kind of cancel culture, if you like, that is very problematic in our world. And as you said, activists are, I think, sort of smacking their lips with glee at the prospects. There was an interesting article written by a professor of constitutional law. And if anybody knows the possible impact of this, it's a professor of constitutional law. And in that article, he basically wrote about how this is going to enable the censorship of religious freedom. He actually said this, and I'll quote, he was excited because the bill will not allow individuals or organizations, as he writes, to escape censure for their outrageous and harmful views merely because these are couched in religious terms. And he's obviously looking forward to the state giving funding to attack what he calls the corrosive impact of religious teachings and the harm caused by them. That should send a bit of a chill through your spine if all you're doing is simply expressing your legitimate faith and beliefs, and
Yes.
yet you could be facing
Incidentally,
serious
that
problems.
professor, when he's referring to that, is these terrible views. Is, for instance, the view that marriage is between a man and a woman
Yes, yeah,
in
and so
terms of the Word of God.
yeah, and so that exactly you will be censured for your what we would obviously say your right under the Constitution to freely express and live out your faith.
Now, what impact would it have on the church specifically?
Well, I think the problem that the church is going to find, among other things, is that their autonomy is under severe threat. So, for example, one of the things which is problematic is the increase in the definition of equality. And equality has not just been that everybody has sort of equal rights to law and to due process and what have you, but basically it's equal rights, and I'm going to again try and quote it exactly, to access equal rights and access to resources, opportunities, benefits, and advantages. And that basically means that whatever one person is entitled to, everybody is entitled to. And so, again, it's irrelevant if you have perhaps some criteria that you might try to ring fence what perhaps you as a church believe or the members of your church will enjoy,
criteria.
or what have you. Membership criteria, anything like that, is essentially swept away. And if you do discriminate against somebody, if they feel that somehow they're prejudiced by that or their dignity is undermined, then they have an action for discrimination. And so your autonomy in that sense is very prohibited. And it's interesting because I've thought about this in terms of the single marriage statute, which we also are concerned about. And again, on the same date, submissions closed for that one as well, for the comments on the policy. But one of the problems with that is that there is still no direct protection in the statutes that have been put forward by the South African Law Reform Commission to protect the conscientious religious rights of religious marriage officers, who are obviously, in that sense, kind of helping the state. They're standing sort of in proxy for the state in one sense. But they should never be forced to marry against their will. Now, it may be that if that went ahead, you might just hand your license back and say, well, I'm not going to live with that. But this potentially says that if you're marrying anybody, even if you're doing the solemnization or the spiritual side of it, and you're offering that benefit to somebody, you must offer it to everybody. And if you don't, then even though you might have handed in your license, you still may be up for unfair discrimination.
And this is, and bizarrely, and I want us to go back to PEPUDA, but bizarrely, this could mean that pastors and marriage officers will have to do polygamous marriages, polyandrous marriages.
Yes.
I didn't know the word existed
I
until
didn't
2
either.
weeks ago. And there is a party that's arguing that there has to be polyandry if there's polygamy. And to be frank, if I can be honest, I don't believe that polygamy, let alone polyandry, is God's plan, and I believe it's an extreme negative for our society. One of the key criteria that I saw in violent crime is the lack of fathers, and polygamy leads to can create absent fathers, and it's one of the reasons we have such high crime. We have 61% fatherlessness rate in South Africa, father not present. So let me be clear that we are opposed to both polyandry and polygamy. Yeah. Anyway, let's quickly go back to and finish off PEPUDA. As I understand it, also every NGO, which I think the churches would fall into, would have to publish a plan.
Yes, you have to basically, it says that you must, and the emphasis is again on the word must. You must basically implement in your relationships and also in your public activities this definition of equality and discrimination. And perhaps more significantly, it specifically empowers the responsible minister, who in the case of the religious sector would almost certainly be the Cogta minister, currently Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma.
The woman who shut the churches down the last time.
Yes, the very same. And the minister is then empowered to pass regulations and codes of practice to basically eliminate discrimination and, of course, inequality that you then must implement as a religious organization. So that view, the state's view effectively of inequality and discrimination, would then be crammed down on churches. And what that means is that if you then refuse, and interestingly enough, they're allowed to discriminate. They can actually cherry pick, if you like, an organization based on their size and resource and influence. They can actually tailor regulations and codes to make sure that you are, if you like, held to their account of their version of this. And again, if you do not, then you will face the full force of the law. Very concerning. It is regulation of religion, which we've resisted, state regulation of religion. It is, instead of coming in through what the CRL were proposing, some form of peer review committee and slightly through a sort of a bleak way, this is straight through the front door regulation of the churches. It's the end of religious autonomy. We've actually called it, FORSA, the death knell of religious freedom in South Africa. And I don't think we're exaggerating when we say that. And we believe that it will equally impact, for example, faith-based education, that you won't be able to have criteria where you have an ethos of a private school. We're not talking the state school here. We're talking about a private school. Because if you exclude anybody, that can potentially be seen as prejudicial to them, and it might be seen to have undermined their dignity. So it removes autonomy of religion. It pretty much eliminates faith-based schools. If you have a constitution for your church, and most churches do, effectively you might as well tear it up if this is passed in its current form.
Now, I want to just pick up on a comment. Hazel Clement says, has the church been sleeping in the last few years? And the answer is that for SA, and I think we can say Word of Faith have not been sleeping on religious freedom, but there has been a general sleep in the rest of the church. And that's why we are that's why we are currently that's why I've got Michael here. I've set up 2 pastors' meetings that may or may not be cancelled today, and why and I think that Michael can confirm that I've put a lot of work into religious freedom.
Huge amount. Yeah. Now, Richard would probably, if I had a medal, I'd probably pin it on his chest right now. He's been an absolute stalwart and an incredible supporter in everything: time, effort, energy, money, expertise, everything. But it is true that I think finally the sleeping giant might be waking up. And it's, I think, significant perhaps to mention that it's not just the Christian faith that is concerned about this.
That's the point I want to pick up.
I mean, I've been invited, and we have spoken at the highest level to people from leadership from the Islamic faith, from traditional African spirituality. We have canvassed far and wide, even amongst, obviously other denominations in the Christian faith as well. And there is a universal, uniform, deep level of concern about this. And again, I think perhaps worth mentioning at this point, we only have until Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 3 days in which to get our submissions in. And maybe we should also just say that we believe that the easiest way, perhaps at this stage, to do so is to go to the forsa.org.za website. And there you will see a click-through link which takes you to a neutral platform specifically designed to allow you to make submissions with literally a couple of clicks in a way that is legal, that will be recorded. Every voice counts. It literally takes 2 minutes to make your voice heard.
Let me just, you mentioned the Muslims. What is their view on this bill?
They are absolutely up in arms about it. The focus of this has actually been, in my view, extraordinary. I mean, I was invited to speak with Advocate Nadine Badenhorst to the United Ulama Council of South Africa. That's their sort of most senior governing body of the Islamic faith. I've been invited to speak by the Muslim Judicial Council, and they are literally in mosques the last 2-3 weeks. Every single time the mosque opens, the imam is specifically telling the congregants, you need to make your submissions. We need to oppose this. This is anti-Islamic as they see it. So every faith, I think, is going to be equally affected.
So I want to make this clear that we at Word of Faith believe in religious freedom. So we believe that Muslims should be able to practice their faith, Hindus. We believe that the way to deal with what we disagree is to win them for Jesus. So we're unashamedly evangelical. And I know for one service we asked how many ex-Muslims were in our church. And in one service we had over 30 people who had once been adherents of the Islamic faith in our church in one service. So we are unequivocally and unashamedly evangelical. But at the same time, they should have the right to practice their religion and act according to their faith within the normal laws of the country.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this part up because there are two more issues I need to talk to you about. How do people object?
So the best way is at this stage to go to the forsa.org.za website, and there you will see right on the home page a link, make a submission, and it takes you to the Dear South Africa or Dear SA platform. And there you can scroll down a little bit, and there you can see all the reasons, almost a little summary of the reasons and the things that we've chatted about today, and you can put those in your comment and your reason for objecting. We frankly are saying at this stage that we do not support this at all. We believe that this bill should be scrapped. We typically, when we look at potential legislation, we try and see, could we tweak it? Could we amend it? Should something be inserted in it that would protect religious freedom rights? But there are so many, many things in this amendment bill that are contrary to religious freedom that we just can't see how it
What's
can be
quite interesting is I read submissions by Professor Tuli Madonsela, who's a real hero of mine, and she supports efforts to improve equality and social justice. But the refrain of her criticism of the bill is that it always gives the state an out.
Yeah.
So they say the state must do this and this, and then there's always an out. So really what this is it's an absolute, it's moving the burden of equality from the state onto the private sector, onto companies, onto churches, onto NGOs, onto the mosques, wherever. This bill is reprehensible, and I need you to go out and get as many people as you possibly can to object against this. We have 57,000 objections.
Just through the Dear SA platform,
Yes.
so there may be more. And I think it's maybe worth quickly pointing out, Richard, that when enough people do push back, it's a very powerful thing. When they tried to introduce the hate crimes and hate speech bill recently, or maybe a few years ago now, the fact that there were so many people that said no, that was going to criminalize typically what you might have said on Sunday. You could have got a 3-year jail sentence for it. And the consequence of that was they put in a specific exemption clause into that, and it subsequently hasn't come back for consideration by Parliament. So that was effective. Whereas when we tried to prevent the stripping of religious freedom rights
This is their second effort. It's the hate speech 2.0.
Yeah, well, yes, effectively. It's like the same thing but through a different door. But that was effective, the pushback. When we contested the Civil Union Amendment Bill, which stripped state marriage officers of their religious freedom rights, unfortunately then there were only 40 submissions from the whole of the religious sector. So somebody asked the question, is the church asleep? Well, they were definitely asleep in that instance, because on the other side of the pile was over 400 from largely LGBT activists who wanted state marriage officers to be compelled to go against their conscience. And the chair at the final meeting just said, well, the people have spoken. So we have the opportunity to speak up, and we need to speak up. We literally need to speak up now, today. Don't even wait. Just get out your cell phone, click on the link, make your submission.
I see the link is in the comments, so please go and click. Come back, but click on that as well. Listen, the marriage bill, you spoke briefly about that. What is the current position of that bill with regards to marriage officers?
Well, there are two concurrent processes going, which is a little confusing. The Department of Home Affairs initiated, I think legitimately, because we have three different statutes. We have the Marriage Act, we have the Civil Union Act, and we have the Traditional Customary Marriages Act. And there are gaps which don't actually cover all types of marriage, and therefore leave people unprotected in terms of children, inheritance rights, what happens in a case of a divorce or a breakup of a relationship. So there was a legitimate reason to look at how these could be, if you like, brought into uniformity to fill in the gaps. But in the process, the South African Law Reform Commission came up, at the request of the Department of Home Affairs, with their idea of what this new legislation should look like. And very concerningly, there was no inclusion of a specific clause that would protect the religious freedom rights of religious marriage officers. And of course, in the absence of such a protection, and particularly when you see it side by side with the marriage policy, which has now also come out and is the one that's still open for comment, by the way, until Wednesday, again, there's even one option which says that all marriage officers should be compelled to solemnize all types of marriages. And that means that you, as a religious person, with no matter what your beliefs might be, even if it's contrary to your conviction or the tenets of the faith of the organization under whose auspices you've been granted this license, that would simply be overridden. And of course, that is so contrary as well to what the minister specifically assured the faith community, because there have been consultations on this. It hasn't just happened in a corner. They've done road shows, and we've been on, I think, 2 panels, and the minister said and gave an assurance that the religious freedom rights of religious marriage officers would be respected. And yet, when you actually look at the wording in the policy, it really is almost like denigrating of religious convictions and beliefs. And perhaps the good news is that tomorrow, Monday, there is a high-level panel discussion which the minister has called. The Minister of Home Affairs has called, and we, FORSA, represented by our advocate Nadine Badenhorst, will be at that panel and obviously making representation to ensure that they are fully aware that they must protect and be good to their word, that the religious freedom rights of religious marriage officers must be protected.
I think one of the interesting, let me use an interesting example. For instance, in terms as matters stand right now on the proposal, if someone has been divorced, they could go to the Catholic Church and the law would compel the priest to marry someone who had been divorced before.
Yes.
Now, I disagree with the Catholic stance on that. But the point is I don't believe the state should be in a position to pick and choose and decide how, where, and what.
No, not at all.
And it's important that we protect the right of the Catholic Church, even if we disagree with them. It is free. It's about freedom of choice. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about allowing people the autonomy to make decisions for themselves without the law criminalizing their actions.
Yes. Yeah, because we have talked about the fact that if you are in breach, for example, and just let's look at PEPUDA, and the court makes an order against you, and you do not comply with that order, then ultimately the sanction is that you can be sent to jail. And so this is no small matter. And that is why I think it is so critical that we speak up at this time.
There was a matter here in Port Elizabeth with a dominie who said something, and they employed a translator because court procedures are now in English, and they mistranslated it, totally mischaracterized what he said, and they took him to court, and they've dragged him through the court for 3 years now.
Wow.
And I'm not sure where the case is now, but they actually eventually admitted that their translator had mistranslated it. And what they said he had said, it just simply wasn't true because he'd communicated in Afrikaans. So this is something that can easily and will easily be misused. So what do people do about this? How do they object to this Marriage Act?
Well, again, on the FORSA website, we have a particular article which sets out some of the concerns that we have with it, and you can also click on a link and that will take you through to a template submission which you can then fill in for yourself. It gives you the address, the contact detail, and also the rationale as to why we're concerned about it. And specifically, we are concerned about the protection of religious freedom rights. That is, we think, a fundamentally important thing. And bear in mind this, that of the 16,500 plus minus marriage officers that there are in South Africa, 15,000 are actually religious marriage officers. And so even if pushed to it, and I don't think we should be, because I think already that's a serious erosion of religious freedom rights, but even if people were pushed to the place where you're now going to be forced to and you hand your license back, well, that will create absolute chaos.
Yes.
I mean, the whole marriage system of South Africa will effectively collapse because government will then be needing to employ another 15,000 people and train them. And how difficult will it be for
And
you
those
who wants to get
salaries
married
yes.
to actually then even go to such a person?
In some terrible, dirty corridor in a court somewhere. I want to say something. We Christians, we need to stop voting for Christmas. It's we like turkeys voting for Christmas. You cannot vote for parties that seek to pass legislation that persecutes religious freedom in the church. We have to stop it. We have to campaign against these parties. We cannot stand back. You need to find a party that is respectful of your rights, and specifically to religious freedom, and doesn't want to ride over them. The next point that I want to make is us to just discuss briefly is CSE, because Corinne de Klerk, I think she's a teacher, and she spoke about how it's becoming more and more difficult to be a teacher and what she's compelled to teach.
Well, again, I mean, you may recall, I think it was about 2 years ago now, in Parliament, the Department of Basic Education presented basically content to teach on sex and sexuality in school, comprehensive sexuality education, otherwise known as CSE. They presented what they saw as approved content. And we were then given sight for SA. I actually went to Parliament. I got a sneak preview, if you like. And it was absolutely evident that the material that was being taught from a very liberal ideological value base.
Listen, my grade 10 son was taught about the different gender identities, including one called a helicopter. I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember what a helicopter does, but that's a gender identity. Grade 10.
Well, again, the point is that we have a public school system now. We don't have a state school system. And the big distinction between the apartheid era and the democratic South Africa we live in is, particularly in education, it is now a partnership between parents and the state. And parents are typically represented by school governing bodies, which is why school governing bodies are so important. And parents need to get involved and engaged in the school governing bodies of their local schools. So this affected public schools. And they were basically saying that this was the compulsory content that had to be implemented. And that is unlawful. That goes even against the policy of the education department. And so we said, no, you cannot, as the state, cram down an ideological viewpoint, because you cannot teach on sex and sexuality without some kind of a value basis. It's impossible. It's not like mathematics where 1 + 1 = 2. And after a big pushback, we first of all ascertained where did this curriculum come from, where did this content come from. And it was an international content. It was largely sponsored by an organization called Planned Parenthood, who are the biggest abortion providers in the world. And we also discovered that government, or a Department of Government, had been paid R500 million to roll this out into the school system. And so again, we often say, follow the money.
Yes.
If you want to see where the intention is.
So was the money from Planned Parenthood?
No, the money was from a US aid.
Okay, yes, they work hand in glove.
And that was exposed because of a question in Parliament. And it's important because eventually what happened, after a big scuffle and lots of threatening by the Department of Basic Education to parents and teachers, neither of whom groups were consulted in the process. It was just presented as a fait accompli. Was that actually, no, they did have to abide by the existing laws of the land that they obviously need to subscribe to. And now parents, very importantly, parents, please listen to this, you do not have to accept the comprehensive sexuality education content that is provided. There are alternatives, and if you as a school governing body go and get one of these alternative excellent contents, and I want to give a shout out to Family Policy Institute, Errol Naidu, who I think might be well known to many people, who does a fabulous job looking after and protecting family interests and parental rights. They have got recommended alternative curriculum that you can access and therefore have implemented in the public school, assuming that the school governing body actually approves it, which is, again, why parents really do need to get involved in these things.
So we want to encourage you to get onto school governing bodies. You need to start to put pressure on the principal and teachers to have a value-based system. I read an article about a week and a half ago, and the number one indicator or the number one cause of people falling away from church is a secular school system. It's the overwhelming cause of any falling away from church. And I want to be clear with you. Look, obviously, I think in the next day or two, in the next few weeks, we won't be able to have children's church, but it's absolutely imperative that you get your children into children's church. You cannot afford to not get your children into children's church, and you need to read the Bible with them. You need to pray with your children. You need to lead them in the way they should go, because when they're old, they will not depart from it. And I want to encourage you to not take these things lightly. People who are blasé end up in terrible situations, and they're surprised. Word of Faith is not a blasé church. That's why we got Michael Swain here. And I want to encourage you to keep following FORSA. We will continue to work. I will continue to work on religious freedom issues, and we cannot be blasé about it. Michael, any final remarks?
I think it is such a good thing that people wake up. There is no merit in being ignorant. You may recall, and many will, the sons of Issachar were commended specifically because they understood the times. So you must stay informed. We would definitely recommend that you go to the FORSA website and that you also sign up for our newsletter, and we will then make sure that you are kept advised and alerted where we see these issues coming down. But very importantly, Wednesday, the 30th, is the deadline. And this is the moment where you please must go and click on that submission. It literally takes 2 minutes of your time. Make your voice heard. Every voice counts. And bear in mind that this is our watch. And whatever we do or don't do is going to impact our children and their children. And a right that we have, which has been hard won, can be very easily lost. So this is the moment, I believe, and I would encourage and urge you and exhort you. Take that moment, make your submissions, make your voice heard.
So I want to encourage you to please go and object to both these acts, and I want us to stay engaged. Who would have ever thought that the church could prevent us from meeting? I mean, the state could prevent us from meeting. I'm almost certain that we will be prevented yet again for the next few weeks. My point is that this is not something that we need to take lightly or lying down. If we want to preserve and our goal is to pickle our country, to disciple our country in the teachings of Jesus. And this is part of that mandate. So I want to thank Michael for coming to Port Elizabeth. I want to thank him for ministering this morning and giving us such an informative interview this evening.
I could just say, Richard, one other thing I would like to say is we FORSA, this is what we exist to do. We are very much standing as the watchman on the wall, standing in the gap in a very real sense. And if you've been watching this and this program and you believe that we are adding value and we are helping to defend and protect and promote our religious freedom rights, would you please add value to us? Because we depend upon, we need people's contributions and support to enable us to continue to do what we do. So thank you so much for that consideration.
Thank you, and bless you. Good night. Thank you for coming on.